taken away the members of the committee's right to vote on whether to go into executive session. So this becomes a bit of a problem. Taking away the members' right to vote on whether to accept a particular piece of information in executive session appears to violate Rule 11, Clause 2G1. Certainly, it is at least not in the spirit of the rule, which is meant to keep all committee records public and available unless a specific exception is met. So this is problematic. You prevent the committee members from viewing the committee's records. And we're voting today to actually prevent the public from having access to committee records as well without any of the particular sections and exceptions. And so with that, I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank my friend from Arizona for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I am stunned that you don't agree with me on this amendment. And saddened also. I just want to point out that and I'm sure a staff member wrote this and that that the chairman, while reading it carefully, I'm sure missed this one point. But what the second whereas says is the special counsel Mueller's report found that the Russian government interfered and that President Trump used his official powers to thwart or attempt to thwart. The word thwart doesn't appear in the special counsel's report. The idea that the Mueller report found that President Trump tried to thwart or thwarted or attempted to thwart, it just does not, is not consistent with that report. The truth is that the Mueller report did not make findings as to the 10 allegations. All I'm asking this committee to do is put in this whereas accurate legal language that is cited in the Mueller report so that the American public is not misled by this whereas. And I think it is only fair that this committee not impugn the integrity of the President of the United States until such time as it has evidence that it wants to charge the President with. This is false, and it should be clarified, and I would ask for the chairman to reconsider his opposition, and I hope that members on the other side of the aisle agree that we should have an accurate document. And I yield back to my friend from Arizona.
With that, I yield.
The gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
To strike the last word. To strike the
gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support my colleague's amendment because it calls for clarification. Talking about clarification, I do have one question for my Democrat colleagues, and that is, are you conducting an investigation, or an impeachment investigation or not? Because the resolution we are considering today does not authorize a formal impeachment inquiry, despite what the press might report today. It is nothing more than an inquiry into whether to start an inquiry. None of these provisions are unique to the impeachment proceedings. Anyone at any time can send a letter to the committee. Every committee in the House can allow for staff questioning. What we're doing today is meaningless. You already have this power as a committee. So which is it? Are you starting an impeachment investigation or not? Is this just more smoke and mirrors so you can appease the far left while doing absolutely nothing about this issue? Or is this so you can avoid talking about an agenda that includes banning airplanes, throwing Americans off their health insurance plans, eliminating our borders, maybe other parts of the platform like defunding ICE, giving illegal immigrants free health care, maybe banning oil and gas exploration? I mean, is that what this is about? Is this about distracting from the real platform of the party?
Would the gentleman yield?
No. Since November 2016, the Democratic Party has desperately tried to undo the will of the people. And I can tell you that in southwestern Pennsylvania, people want Congress to move on. They want us to work together. They want us to solve real issues that are facing America. They want their roads and bridges repaired. They want help fighting the opioid epidemic. And they want more money in their pockets to feed their families. So again, I ask, are you conducting an impeachment inquiry or not? If you are, just be honest with the American people. Be honest with your colleagues. If you aren't, then let's stop these political games and let's go to work for the American people. I've got a bipartisan bill on clean slate. Again, this bill is bipartisan. It would help millions of Americans get away from the stigma of having a nonviolent criminal record on their record. It would help them re-enter the workplace, increase their wages. This is bipartisan. We could actually do this. I'm friends with a lot of my colleagues. I've talked to them privately. We want to do something to help the American people, and we can start with criminal justice reform and a slew of other issues. But Mr. Chairman, let's do something. Let's stop the political theater. Our country deserves better. With that, I yield.
Will the gentleman yield so he can answer his question?
No, I yield.
So the answer is yes. We are engaged in impeachment investigation. And in addition to that, we have moved aggressively forward on our For the People agenda. It is about driving down healthcare costs, driving down the cost of prescription drugs, rebuilding the infrastructure of America, and taking on the corruption here in Washington.
Regular order.
Gentleman was not recognized. Gentleman from Pennsylvania has the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do thank and I mean this with sincerity, I thank my friend and colleague from Rhode Island. Thank you. And with that, I yield to my friend and colleague from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I also want to thank the gentleman from Rhode Island for admitting what we all know is happening. This committee is trying to have impeachment without actually putting a resolution before the people, before this House. I want to thank Mr. Buck for his amendment, revealing what a farce this process is, this resolution, which is, again, amateur hour when it comes to legal drafting. I have great respect for the chairman. I have great respect for members of this committee. They are accomplished attorneys. This committee should remember that words mean something, and what we are just revealing in this one amendment is just how these words are not legally accurate. We want this resolution, any product of this committee, to be legally accurate. Let's be better. Let's do better. Or do my colleagues on the other side actually recognize that, in fact, as I question the special counsel, his interpretation of the obstruction statutes was incorrect and is not a normal and reasoned understanding of our obstruction statutes. So if they want to vote to reject that this is, in fact, obstruction as alleged, let them go ahead. But I appreciate the gentleman from Rhode Island's admission that this is, in fact, an impeachment process.
The gentleman yield back?
I yield to Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I saw the gentleman from Rhode Island leave. I didn't know if you were putting time out because nobody on the Democrat side has so far voiced any answers to us, and I appreciate the gentleman's answer, and I yield back.
The gentleman yielded back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, for what purpose is she seeking?
The gentlemen are, sorry, I moved to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
You know, the gentleman from Rhode Island got before me, but I too would answer, yes, we are in impeachment investigation. Have you not been reading the proceedings? I don't think there's a question. It's an investigation.
Does the gentlelady yield back? The question occurs on the gentleman. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Now that it's been publicly admitted that this is an impeachment investigation, and these amendments are even more critical because words do matter. And this would be litigated, and going back to my days as a Chief Justice, where we really had to dig on individual words. What does this word mean? And for whatever reason, the majority in this impeachment investigation chose to use twice the word thwart. And I could see this going up. If this were a successful impeachment and removal from office, clearly it would go up to the highest court, and they would be stuck with the question of the president being a thwarter. They would have to deal with issues like, does thwarting involve moral turpitude? Because we've already heard it's not a crime to thwart that any of us are aware of. So, and the chairman had said, oh, it doesn't have to be a crime. Well, does thwarting involve moral turpitude? There are so many issues that would be raised on appeal by the misuse of proper legal terminology. This would be litigated for time immemorial, and it's just unfortunate. If you're going to try to remove a man for office for seeking justice and trying to stop himself from being framed by an unjust group within the Justice Department, then you really, this committee of all committees ought to use proper terminology and not create unnecessary litigation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? No further amendments? Then, a reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to agree to the resolution. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to. The roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Mr. Richmond votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Aye. Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Steen?
Aye.
Ms. Steen votes aye. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Collins?
No.
Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner?
No.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
That's a no.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Ms. Roby? Ms. Roby votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein?
No.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Stubbe votes no.
Gentlelady from California?
Ms. Bass votes aye.
Gentlelady from Washington?
Ms. Jayapal votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to vote who haven't voted? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 17 noes.
The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.